Frank Rigg, another resident of Carlisle, and a friend of mine, is the former curator of the JFK Library, and before that he was the director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, and he's originally from the mother country. So without further ado, I'll give you Frank Rigg.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to talk about presidential libraries. It seemed an appropriate time to do that, as this is the week of President's Day.
Frank, can you get the microphone a little closer to your face? Sorry.
How's that?
That's better, yeah, thanks.
Okay. And also, as President Obama comes down to the end of his term, you're probably going to see quite a bit about the development of his library. As always happens when the president is involved in that process of planning, there's always a lot of commentary in the media about it. So I thought this might be interesting to inform you about what goes on with all that stuff. The presidential libraries are not actually libraries as we commonly understand them. They don't have a lot of books in them. People sometimes go thinking they'll see stacks and stacks of books and shelves of books, and actually libraries have books, mainly for reference purposes that they keep in the research rooms, but the main purpose is to preserve and provide the public access to the papers and artifacts, film, photographs, tape recordings of a president's career, his life, his term in office. Presidential libraries, like their contents, the things that they contain, belong to the people of the United States. As with many things concerning the story of the presidency of the United States, in a way, the story of presidential libraries began with George Washington. When he left office in 1797, he packed up whatever papers he had saved and took them to his house in Mount Vernon. He regarded them as his personal property. And this set a legal precedent that every president up until Ronald Reagan has followed. And consequently, presidential papers, records were lost, scattered, sold to collectors and autograph hunters, ruined by poor storage conditions, and even destroyed on purpose. After Abraham Lincoln's death, Mrs. Lincoln burned all his White House papers. I'm not sure why. So there was no continuous record of presidential communications and actions. And nothing changed until 1939, when President Franklin Roosevelt was looking at the quantity of papers that he and his White House staff had accumulated and thought there should be a better alternative. So he consulted with his advisors, historians, archivists, and he began planning his presidential library by donating those papers, his personal papers, his presidential papers, to the federal government. Friends of his, associates, formed a nonprofit corporation to raise funds for the construction of the first presidential library and museum on his estate in Hyde Park. And Congress agreed to accept that facility as a gift, along with the evidence of his presidency, including his White House papers, his and Eleanor's personal papers, official photos, film artifacts, including many valuable gifts that he and his wife received from foreign governments, such as large amounts of very valuable jewelry that Eleanor received as gifts. And FDR's own personal collection, very significant collection of maritime art. And his motivation stemmed from his belief that all these things were part of the national heritage and they should be available for the public to examine and study. And in turn, the U.S. government pledged to operate and maintain the building and its contents, employing archivists and conservators, curatorial and exhibit specialists to work on preserving and organizing them and making them available in a museum or in a research room. And with some slight changes, that tradition was followed until the present. In 1955, Congress passed an act to make this a regular feature, and in the same year, Harry S. Truman opened his presidential library in Independence, Missouri, which happens to be among my favorites because it's so down-homey. And he used to walk down there, down the street to the library every day, and the reporters would wait for him, and he'd come out with these quips that he was famous for. And Herbert Hoover followed in 1962, opening his library in West Branch, Iowa. And everybody followed that example, all the way through George Bush, whose library opened in 2013 at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. Most of them are in the hometown or state of the president. The Obama Library will be on the south side of Chicago, where he spent a lot of time. The President's White House files are the core of presidential libraries. These are the White House files. They're not the files of the executive departments. All those, like Department of Defense papers, Secretary of State, State Department papers, Treasury papers, they're all kept to the National Archives in Washington. Now, the kinds of documents that presidential libraries have kept have varied. The earlier libraries, all paper files. Later libraries, digital files. The quantity of documents varies. The earlier libraries have fewer documents, and the later, many, many more. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is the different presidents' time in office varied, so that you had JFK, who served for 2 years and 10 months, and then you have half a dozen who served 2 terms. That is 8 years. And so consequently, the amount of paper, amount of records that were generated were different. The size of staff also varied. When George Washington was president, I think he had a messenger and a clerk, and that was it. And that's the way he stayed pretty much. And even in the 40s and 50s, they seldom got above 100 staff, maybe 200 staff. Today, the president has a staff of 2,000. Wow. So consequently, they are churning out more stuff that the president is obliged to save. Clinton had the largest number of paper records and EV records, who were the smallest? George W. Bush had the largest set of electronic holdings. Well, who gets to see all this stuff? Well, until President Nixon, the papers were donated to the United States government by the president, and he could receive a tax write-off for the gift. Now, in addition, presidential associates, White House staff, and family members gave papers, and these gifts came with deeds of gift. And they often, those deeds spelled out the terms whereby people could see them and read them and study them. And they might be, they wouldn't be open for X number of years, or only with the permission of the donor, or of a committee representing the president or his heirs, until all persons mentioned in them are dead, or would cause harm to the donor. So there was restrictions. Another restriction was if materials were classified, top secret, whatever. And in America, those documents can remain secret forever. Unlike many other governments, say in Britain, a classified document has to be opened after 50 years. Well, here we have documents from World War I that are still classified. The problem is, in part, is that the department which issues those classifications is the only one that can authorize their declassification. So stuff, just millions and millions of pages of this stuff, and there just aren't enough archivists with the security classification necessary to go through these and determine whether to recommend they be declassified. So we had this huge pile, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any smaller anytime soon. The changes in this whole model came with President Nixon, when Watergate threw a spanner in the works, because Nixon's papers, including the infamous tape recordings with their expletive deleteds and the evidence of his knowledge and involvement in the cover-up of the Watergate break-in, were seized by Congress as they were investigating. The chef's using a pretty big mixer. They were seized by Congress. They had potential evidence after he was impeached for the trial that he was about to be about to have. The Senate would determine whether he was guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, and whether he should be removed for office. And so all these papers that were his White House records were kept in the custody of the National Archives. He, of course, resigned, and President Ford pardoned him. And so that made the whole question of a trial in the Senate moot. And he turned around and sued the government for illegal seizure of his property. Because, in terms of the legal precedent, they were his property. Everybody since Washington through Kennedy and Johnson, and had owned their presidential papers. So why should he be treated differently? And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, or rather in favor of his estate, because he passed away by this time. And he was awarded $16 million, the appraised value of all that material, and people were shocked. People were shocked that this little known but long established precedent existed. Nobody knew the president owned his papers. It was never made a big deal of. And so, and then the other shoe dropped with he got a tax write-off for it. So he was going to get rich because of Watergate. And people were outraged. And so Congress changed the law. And in 1978, Congress made presidential records automatically government property owned by the people of the United States. They weren't gifted anymore. So there were no deeds to, with the restricted clauses as to who could see them. Or indeed, there was no question of what had been selected as to be included in those papers or omitted from those papers. And President Reagan was the first to be affected by the law. Changed the whole framework for access to papers, requiring libraries to respond to any inquiries for access, and they had to give a reason for why access was denied. And so the Freedom of Information Act became the rule which determined how people could see or not see various government papers. It includes a statutory right for an individual to be given the privilege, or rather it was a right, to see what had gone on in a presidency through its files. And that right is enforceable in court, and it's also supported by various transparency and open government initiatives. A note on tape recordings. All the presidents since FDR, but not until JFK, did the practice. All the presidents since FDR have tape recorded materials. But it wasn't until JFK that the practice became more frequent, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, because he was so mad after the disaster of the Bay of Pigs, and everybody on the White House staff was going around pointing fingers at other people as to whose fault it was, and saying, "Oh no, it wasn't me. I became so mad at all that he decided he was going to record the meetings so that none of that could occur." Johnson and Nixon increased the practice, and some of them are highly entertaining, particularly Johnson's, known for his colorful language. And I hope you don't mind if I share an example of that. I was down at the Johnson Library once listening to these tape recordings, and he was having a discussion with somebody about a particular Texan politician who had been caught supporting both sides of an argument, and both sides were mad at him. And Johnson said of him, he was at this convention, and Johnson said he was as nervous as a whore in church. It just a riot. Anyway, another one documents JFK trying to persuade Senator Richard Russell of Georgia to serve on the Warren Commission investigating the Kennedy assassination. And Johnson said, Russell didn't want to. He kept turning him down saying, no, I'm not going to do it. And finally Johnson said, nah, Dick, there ain't nobody I love more than you, except my mama. And I know you'll accept your president's call. And he did. Harry Truman is recorded as answering a question about Joe McCarthy, the Reds under the bed senator from Wisconsin. Harry said, there's only one thing you need to know about Joe McCarthy. He's a no-good lying son of a bitch. And of course, JFK, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the tape recordings are very valuable. They totally changed people's views of that incredible moment in history. Many writers had portrayed JFK as a hawk who pushed the crisis, pushed the United States to the brink of nuclear war. And actually, what the recordings show is that, and it's amazing to listen to them because you're actually in the cabinet room. As these advisors and the president are discussing what are we going to do, knowing that a wrong step could blow the whole world up. And all of his advisors, practically, were encouraging him to invade Cuba, bomb Cuba, and some, such as Curtis LeMay, the Air Force general, actually taunted him with being a coward, not to do those things. And of course, since after the missile crisis was over and the various materials were released from the Soviet Union, it became clear that, yes, indeed, if he had taken either of those steps, the Soviet Union would have launched nuclear missiles, and we would have been in a thermonuclear war.
Wow.
But Kennedy alone kept resisting his advisors. Just let's try this, and just trying to buy time, hoping that Khrushchev would respond in a way that would resolve the crisis. And of course he did eventually, but not, it was touch and go. Kennedy was increasingly under impossible pressure to take action, military action. And so his role is now seen as one that contributed to the positive outcome. Whereas his brother Bobby, who took credit for being, a peacemaker on this, was actually one of the leaders encouraging him to drop the bombs and invade the island, and as did many others take credit for playing a more peaceful role. It's interesting too that the Secret Service installed the machines, but he controlled them. He turned them on and off, and often he left them on. So you'll be listening, and suddenly you'll see a lawnmower outside the window, cutting the grass on the White House lawn, or you hear a vacuum cleaner, where some cleaners in the office, the Oval Office, cleaning it up. There are now 13 presidential libraries. In the 60s and 70s, we had a series of short presidencies, presidents serving less than 2 terms: JFK, LBJ, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and the President Bush, the first President Bush, which led to concern about the number of these things and the growing cost of maintaining them and operating them. And there was a trend towards building bigger facilities, more monumental facilities, and people worried about the corresponding exaltation of the executive branch as opposed to the legislative or judicial branch of government. They're always controversial, and in particular, they're controversial as you get close to the founding of a library. And so that's why over the next year you'll see more reportage, commentary, criticism of presidential libraries. It's like clockwork almost. Congressmen start talking about presidential libraries being pyramids to past presidents and the glorification of the presidency. And in 1986, Congress passed legislation that would limit the size of a presidential library. And if it was built bigger than that, an endowment had to be provided to pay for whatever costs went with that extra size. And of course, in recent years, as I said, White House records are now electronic. They take up less space than paper, but there are more of them, hugely more. And they raise all kinds of questions about changing formats for reading those records, about issues of security. How do you prevent people hacking into those records? And how do you preserve them? Will they last? I mean, we don't really know how long these records will last. And there's so many of them. All told, presidential libraries hold 400 million pages of documents, 10 million photos, 15 million feet of film, 100,000 hours of recordings, and 500,000 historical objects. So when I leave it there, there's much more to presidential libraries: museums, educational programs, special events. But I think that'll take me at least into next week. So there you go. Yes.
Awesome, Frank. Have you been able to go to most of the libraries? Have you?
Not all of them, but I have been to most. And funnily enough, the closest one I haven't been to, which is the FDR Library in Hyde Park, New York, which I'm told is really beautiful and includes Eleanor Roosevelt's cottage, Valkill, and the house itself is open to the public. It's owned by the National Park Service. And I remember when Valkill, Eleanor's cottage, was opening, and I ran into a colleague of mine in the National Park Service. His name was Tom Mercer, who was the head of public affairs for the Northeast region of the National Park Service. And I said, "Oh, Tom, are you going to the opening of Valkill?" And he said, "Well, actually, no." I said, "You know, that's a little awkward for me. You see, because my aunt was Lucy Mercer, who was one of FDR's mistresses."
Oh.
And so, yes, no, he said, I will not be going to that. I've been to pretty much the recent ones. I haven't been to Clinton. I haven't been to Bush 2. and but otherwise, I think I've been to all of them, and they all vary. It's interesting to see that, and it's interesting how things stick in your mind that you see. So at the Reagan, they have the biggest artifact in presidential library collections, which is the old Air Force One, which they got from Boeing, and you can actually go on board and see. It's the same Air Force One as Kennedy used, and everybody after that up to Reagan. So that's a cool thing to have. At the Johnson Library, the two things that impressed me were, one was a shovel, and the other was a letter to his mother. The shovel was sent by this fellow who also sent him a letter that said, "Dear President Johnson, I'm sending you this shovel to bury all the young men who died as a result of you sending them to Vietnam." Which I always thought that was a very gutsy thing for the Johnson Library to display. So that was one side of it. The other was a letter he sent to his mother when he was a young man and he was teaching in West Texas, a very poor area. And he wrote her and said, asked her to send him a box of toothpaste and toothbrushes because his pupils didn't know how to brush their teeth.
Wow.
And that's the Great Society side of Johnson and his generous spirit in terms of trying to lift the poor people in this country. At the Roosevelt Library, I saw this because it came to us on loan for an exhibit, is the original manuscript, well, the final manuscript of his speech after Pearl Harbor, in which the original talked about a date that will live in world history. And he crossed the world history out and put a date that will live in infamy. Kennedy, there are things like that in Kennedy's collections. The one I love, which is when he gave a speech at the City Hall in Paris. And he opened up by saying, some of you may remember this, "I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris." And he actually wrote that in on the speech that had been prepared for him. And of course, Jackie was a huge hit because she was young, stylish, and spoke French perfectly, and that was one of his additions. But also the coconut shell that he scratched a message on, and that eventually brought rescue for his crew when they were stranded behind Japanese lines in the South Pacific. And in a way, but for that coconut shell, maybe he wouldn't have become president. He might have had a much shorter life. The Bush, older President Bush Library, there's a letter from World War II after his plane had been shot down, and he had been picked up by an American submarine, and he wrote a letter on the submarine to his parents, and it is just full of anguish over the loss of his crewmate who died in the crash of the plane, and then also there's a cricket ball on his desk, which caught my eye, obviously coming from England, and that was a gift from the Prime Minister of Great Britain at that time. So that was an interesting thing. Others are, well, at the Hoover Library are the papers of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who many of you may know from the Little House on the Prairie and the Little House in the Big Woods that particularly girls like to read. And she was from Iowa, and so her papers were donated to the Hoover Library. Very impressive. The Eisenhower Library, which is another one that I love because it too is sort of down home. It's in Abilene, Kansas, and you drive from Kansas City way across the prairie, mile after mile after mile, and you get to Abilene. And there, within the grounds of the Eisenhower Library, is what looks and feels like a chapel, but it's not a religious building. But inside are the tombs of Ike and Mamie Eisenhower. And when I went there, it was just after President George W. Bush had been greeted on the aircraft carrier with that big sign, "Mission accomplished." And over Eisenhower's tomb was this quote, his words, "A man whose fame is built on the terrible sacrifices of others should be duly humble." And I thought, gosh, that told you a lot about Eisenhower's character. The Nixon Library, what I found interesting there was on the land, the property of the library, on one corner is his birthplace, the house where he was born, that was brought there. Very humble little house. And at the other corner is this very grand presidential library. And then at the other corner are the graves of Dick and Patricia Nixon. And I thought, gosh, think about that triangle. And what an incredible story is contained within it. The struggle, the strife, the achievements, the terrible, ending. And they all of them have, their own character, obviously based on the president they represent. I'll leave it there.
Very good.